So we've sewn our jacket together. Got the buttonholes in, the bodice sewn together, seams finished, sleeves installed. We've prepped our facings. That's been assembled, serged, and stay stitched, so that's ready to go. The last pieces we have are the collar pieces, the two under collars, which are sewn together at the center back seam. There are a series of notches. There are two notches down here at the lower edge, the neckline edge of the collar. So you're not going to find any notches here. Make sure you're orienting this so the notches are down here on this lower edge. Just pay attention to the shape of this. And we have the top collar with corresponding notches also on this lower edge. So let's assemble this collar together. Assembly for this is very much like the collar for the two-piece collar with stand. I'm just trimming up some interfacing here. We've got our undercollars assembled. We've got our top collar ready to go. Make sure you're paying attention to the orientation of these pieces. I'm going to take my undercollars, place them on top of my top collar. So right sides together. They should have the same shape. If it's upside down, it's not going to fit properly. Make sure they have the same shape. There we go. So with our collars oriented just like this, I'm going to grab some pins. And I'm going to pin around this edge, this diagonal edge, this curved edge, and this diagonal edge. So these three sides, 1, 2, and 3. I'm not worried about what's going on down here. I'm just going to pin around this edge, and this edge. And I will mark with some chalk just so you can see where I'm getting ready to sew. I have a 1/2 inch seam allowance built into this pattern, so I'm just going to mark 1/2 inch in from my raw edges. You don't have to do this, I'm just doing this for demonstration purposes so you can see what I'm getting ready to do. There we go. So I'm going to sew along these 3 edges. I'm going to start on one end, pivot in the corner, sew this together, pivot again, and back tack over here. Let me pin these together. Make sure all the raw edges are lining up. A little bit of excess interfacing I might need to trim away. Matching up my raw edges, keeping those aligned. Okay, so I'm going to head to my sewing machine. I'll start on one end, back tack on a number 2 stitch, pivot in this corner, go along this edge, pivot again, and back tack at the end. Be careful when you're going into these corners. You may want to switch to a number 1 stitch to get some more dexterity to get into those corners. But if you feel confident that you can get right into those corners on a number 2 stitch, you are welcome to do so. Back tack at the beginning. that first corner, walking my way into that corner, and I'll pivot. Now I've marked my stitching line in chalk, but I'm also using the seam guide on my machine to ensure that I'm sewing at a 1/2 inch seam allowance. And back tack at the end. So that is my collars stitched together. Let's go clean up some of the seam allowance, press this, and get this collar done. We're going to do some understitching in a moment, but we need to clean some of the seam allowance up. I'm going to grab some scissors here. So I've sewn at a 1/2 inch seam allowance. It's hard to see because it's in black. I should have used white weft interfacing, but there's my seams sewn in there all along this top edge and along this other diagonal edge here. So keep these open. Everything you've got going on in here, these 2 neckline edges, keep that open. I'm going to trim my 3 seam allowances that I just sewed. Don't worry about this. We're not going to touch this down here at the bottom. We're just worried about these 3 edges. I'm going to trim this to a 1/4 inch along all of the edges. So cut the seam allowance in half. Don't cut too close to your stitching. Do not do 1/8 of an inch. We just need a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Just trim this down. Because you cut too close, you run the risk of getting holes, and we still have stitching to do through this seam allowance. Just like we did on our 2-piece collar, we're going to do some understitching. Now, similar to our outward corners, that sewing sample, we've got 2 outward corners right here. So I'm going to trim some of the extra seam allowance away from these outward corners, just down to about 1/8 of an inch right at that corner. Take down some of that bulk. Same thing over here. Trim it down to about 1/8 inch seam allowance, just so we can reduce some of that bulk in there. Okay. I will head to my iron and use my tailor's board to press these seams open. remember we press these seams open so it's nice clean finish when we turn the collars right side out. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to turn my collar right side out. Push out my corners as best I can. Now depending on the bulk of your fabric, the bulk of your interfacing, you may get sharper corners, you may have softer corners. Let's see if my awl can do any good here. A little bit. Now I poke in with my awl, but I'm doing so on my undercollars. I wouldn't do that on the top collar side. The undercollars will be underneath. Just be very careful if you're using a sharp tool like the awl. You don't want to put holes in yourself or the fabric. Now that that is turned, I'm going to press everything again. Make sure I get my seams right up along that fold so it's nice and clean. And press this again. Okay, so that's pressed in place. I've got a nice finished collar. Here's my top collar and then my under collars with my seam there. I'm going to understitch my collar. My under collars will get my under stitching. So I'm going to go inside of the work here and get to these seam allowances. I'll head back to the work table so I can zoom in a little bit better and you can see what I'm getting ready to do. So there is my turned and pressed collar. This is the side with the under collar. This is where your seam is, your under collars. If I lift this up, you can see there's all that seam allowance in there. I want all of my seam allowance to go towards my under collar. I'm going to push both seam allowances. Here they are pressed open. I'm going to push both of them towards my under collar where my seam is, my center back seam. And I will probably sew it in this orientation just because I like sewing in this orientation. And just as we did before when sewing our two-piece collar, I'm going to understitch right along here. I'm going to do so from the outside of my work, but know that sewing your understitching from the outside ensures that you know that your understitching is going to be nice and uniform in case anybody lifts up the collar. But you're working blind. You need to get accustomed to feeling underneath and making sure that all of this seam allowance is going towards the under collar. You don't want this seam to accidentally start splitting open if you're working in this orientation. So it is up to you. Use your discretion. You can sew from the inside. Just make sure both seam allowances are pushed towards your under collar where your seam is, and you'll stitch at a 1/16 of an inch away from your original line of stitching. So if my original line of stitching was here, I'm going to stitch just to the left of that so I know that all my stitching is going over here to where my under collars are. But for the case of this demo, I will show it from the outside of the collar rather than the inside, just so you can see my stitching, see it a little bit better on my red fabric. Again, I'm going to make sure that both seam allowances are going towards my under collar where my seam is, and I'm going to be feeling underneath as I'm stitching to make sure that both of those seam allowances are going in this direction as I stitch. Number 2 stitch, get as far as you can into that corner. You're going to be a few inches away from it. There's no way to get any closer to it. Don't force it. Just get as close as you can to that point. I'm feeling underneath to make sure both of my seam allowances are going towards my under collar. Sewing on a number 2 stitch. And as we've done before, I want to make sure that my original line of stitching here, where my seam is I'm going to line up with the innermost edge of this toe, so I know that I'm stitching 1/16 of an inch to the left of this. Again, my under collars are to my left, they're over here. And I'm making sure as I sew to feel underneath to make sure all of my seam allowances are going in that same direction. So I'm going to start here on a number 2 stitch, back tack at the beginning. And stitch on through, keeping that seam aligned to the innermost edge of that toe. Feeling to make sure my seam allowances are going in the same direction. And again, get as close as you can into this second corner, but you're only going to be able to get within about an inch or so from that corner. Don't force yourself to get all the way to the corner, it's not going to happen. And back tack at the end. Okay. I'm going to trim my threads here. So there is my understitching going through my 2 seam allowances and my under collar. Nothing visible from the top edge, and it's caused my top collar to roll back. So no one will see the stitching, no one will see my under collars. Both seam allowances are stitched through. I know it's hard to see, excuse me, with the black thread, but I can't lift these up anymore. They're not going to turn back towards the top collar. They're stitched down. I can only get so far into that because they are both seam allowances are stitched down. I'm going to give this one more press on the iron to get this little bit of a roll kind of set into place. And you might notice now that the neckline edge of both of these kind of match up a little bit better. That's because the under collars are made 1/8 of an inch smaller to accommodate for this roll as we do our understitching. So I'll hit this with the iron one more time and our collar will be assembled. So that takes care of our collar assembly with our top collar in one solid piece and our under collars with our seam in the center back and our understitching right along there, causing our top collar to roll back onto itself so we won't see that seam when we're totally finished. So that takes care of the sub-assemblies. We've got our bodice put together with the sleeves, we have our collar assembled, top collar and under collar, and we have our facings assembled. Now let's take a look at how we put all this together into one garment.